One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. In a world where strong and hoppy reigns supreme, it can be easy for less pungent beer styles to get pushed to the bottom of the pile, which is unfortunate considering the historical relevance of so many styles, some of my favorite being traditional British ale. Now, in the earlier days of British brewing, the names of new beer styles were typically descriptive in nature, which is certainly the case for the style we'll be focusing on today. This is the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the classic British ale known as Dark Mild is contributor Andy Carter.
I became fascinated with British ales almost as soon as I started brewing, not just because they were so flavorful, but the alcohol content is so much lower, which means you can have a lot more of them. I mean, the traditional term session beer comes from having sessions of these styles of beer, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really happy to talk about this style just because it's fun to make, it's fun to drink, and hey, if I can make it any faster, more power to me, right?
Yeah, we'll be talking about that. You know, I'm sure that we're going to get into these details later, but when I started brewing, and even when I took the BJCP exam, English mild was a recognized style, but I believe dark mild only made its way to the guidelines, like in the 2015 guidelines. Obviously, this says nothing about the fact mild has been made in various colors, you know, in Britain for a very long time, and I love it. Whether it's light or dark mild, like we're going to be talking about today, I really am looking forward to chatting with you about the history of dark mild, as well as the results of my attempt to brew one using this short and shoddy method. All right, I want to say a huge thanks to everybody who decided to support us on Patreon in the last few weeks. After listening back to what I said on our last Brews Views episode where we talked about 2022 in general, I can see how some might have perceived it as sort of a plea, and I did not mean for it to come across that way. The truth is, a lot of people have moved away from the hobby for whatever reason, which has resulted in us losing patrons, and being that Patreon is our primary source of support, well, you get the picture. So thank you so much if you opted to become a patron of ours in the last couple of weeks, or if you're choosing to do that in the future. We really do appreciate it. And on that note, if you are a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is Brewlosophy's newest contributor and 2022 Oregon State Homebrewer of the Year, Jordan Folks, who, despite being a part of Brewlosophy, still prefers brewing using a bunch of traditional methods. Imagine that, somebody who doesn't allow preferences to detract from experimenting with new things. Pretty crazy thought. I've actually tasted a few of Jordan's beers, and I'll tell you, he is really good. He is a really, really good brewer, makes fantastic beer. This is going to be a great session. To be a part of it, you have to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, January 20th, 2023, as Jordan will be taking questions on Saturday the 21st. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron and all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online. Your experience won't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate it. I just checked this morning and saw that we're past 950 reviews, which is crazy to me, which means we're less than 50 away from that 1,000 mark, and we'd love for your help. I know, man. We'd love for you guys to help us reach that milestone. Doesn't really mean much, except it makes us feel good. So thanks to everybody who's already rated and reviewed the show. We read every single one of those reviews. Feedback this week is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've had the opportunity to brew on both the 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are legit, efficient, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You will not be disappointed with one of these units. In fact, Paul and our newest contributor, Ryan, are brewing on it right now. Plus, the guys behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Antonio Martinez had some feedback on our recent episode where we talked about fermentation temperature when making Weiss beer. He said, I loved this episode and this beer style. My favorite of this style has to be Koenig Ludwig's version. My personal preference leans more toward banana character, but not so much that there's no discernible clove. Like you guys mentioned, I've always heard that lower temperature favors clove. So when I picked up Harold as Weizenkit from More Beer, that's a funny name, I split the difference between 64F and 8, or which is 18C, recommended by Brewing Classic Styles, and the standard ale temp of 68F, which is 20C. I didn't realize the kit came with Safbrew WB06 and already had Lalamand Munich Classic, so I went with that instead. This was the first time I'd seen Krausen climb the walls of a carboy like that. My 7-gallon for Munster barely contained it. In the end, it had just the right amount of banana I was going for, and the keg kicked pretty fast. Another variable I'm eager to try in this style is racking fresh wort to an already fermenting batch around day 3, apparently called Drauflassen. I watched a video of someone who did this and felt he could tell a difference in a side-by-side stating the beer where the fresh wort was added had a more pronounced ester profile.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, I think I've not really ever not explored Weiss beer enough. It's just a style that I enjoy having, usually out, maybe at a beer garden or something like that. Not something I make as much, just because honestly, for the reasons he brought up, it's just it's hard to control that flavor, right? If you know you're going to get a good flavor from a known producer of Weiss beer, right? You know you're going to get the exact amount of banana clove. I sometimes get vanilla. I think I might be an odd man out here, but sometimes I get like a vanilla note from Hefeweizen.
Sure.
And so it's just I'm like I don't want to risk 5 gallons, but it's cool that he's experimenting. And I think there's something to be said about that technique of racking fresh wort onto fermenting yeast, because that's like he saw the top cropping nature of that yeast, right? 7-gallon fermenter couldn't even contain the batch. I think that's and that's something where you're going to get a new generation of yeast, right? Your first generation, second generation, when you buy a pack from any yeast producer, right? That's fresh yeast, unprocessed, right? There's some selective pressure yeast goes under when it hits your fermenter and how it behaves in your fermenter versus the lab. And especially if you do generational pitches or generational racking of yeast, you'll notice a difference. So it's a cool technique. It's not something I've explored, but it's definitely a path to go down if you're into that style.
Totally. I actually know a few people who are that, like you don't meet many brewers these days who are so passionate about Weiss beer, but I've got a couple friends who really are, and they try these different techniques. I'm sure I mentioned it more than once in that episode that Antonio referred to, that I'm not a huge fan of Weiss beer in general. I'm like you, Andy. If I'm out at a pub or whatever, and a buddy of mine, commercial brewer, just made a batch of Weiss beer, I'll drink a pint of it and I enjoy it. I don't want a whole 5 gallons on top at my house. So I sort of feel like I'm the wrong person to ask about techniques for making good Weiss beer. That said, I have heard of this Drauflassen method before, and I think it's really interesting. It does remind me a little bit of like a version of top cropping, like you said, Andy. I'm not sure why it would produce a stronger ester profile, but hey, if banana is your thing, then give it a shot. And I'd love to hear back from you, Antonio, to hear how it worked out for you. So thanks for the feedback, Antonio. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy-show. That's the @ symbol, the Brewlosophy, with a regular U show. Host Martin Keene is going to start dropping weekly episodes in the next few weeks. So make sure you sign up to be notified when episodes drop so that you get to watch them when they come out. We are super excited about the Brewlosophy show, and we think you're going to like it too. So when we come back from this break, the focus will be on Dark Mild. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. My now wife and I had the great fortune to take a trip to England back in 2003, and as a relatively new homebrewer at the time, I was beyond excited for the opportunity to sit in age-old pubs drinking traditional British ale. And in addition to being an unquestionably magical experience overall, it was during this trip that I was introduced to the deliciously quaffable session style known as mild, which has quite a bit of history behind it.
Yeah, so mild as kind of existed, or as it started in these English styles, as mild has been around since roughly the early 19th century. If you read the BJCP notes, which I highly suggest everyone go back for history lessons, because the BJCP really does capture the history well, and there's other resources, specific people have done a lot of work, but usually BJCP does a good job of capturing that. Notes that mild began to get darker in color in the 1880s, eventually becoming the dark brown we see today, which is right after, which we're all from after World War II. So it was getting darker, but now this dark brown color you see is really a product of time.
I like that too, and I think because of that darker color, it's easy to presume, and this is something I learned in the BJCP guidelines as well. But it's easy to presume that mild was kind of an offshoot of porter, but the BJCP notes that is not the case at all, and so it is its own style, and I think that's really cool. And the fact that it got darker over time, that's probably a function of the technology of the kiln technology of the time or whatever. I don't know, but I'm happy it ended up where it did because I think this style is delicious.
Yeah, so mild, you may think mild is just a term for how that's alcohol content, but it was a term used that wasn't aged and generally consumed fresher. So there's a lot of thinking, if you think about modern brewing where we're turning beer very quickly, this is a product of super healthy yeast, really good malt, providing yeast very good health and that sort of thing. So beer was aged a little more back then, especially when it was in transport too. So it's not necessarily about its strength, and particularly when you compare it to stout, which was definitely a different style and different alcohol content at the time. Yeah,
and like you said, my understanding with the majority of British ale back in the early 19th century, late 18th century is that it would sit around for quite a while in these barrels before being consumed, and that age helped the beers to kind of mellow out or whatever it was. And mild, what they're saying is that the term mild came from the fact that it was usually drank fresh. I'm not sure how that works out, but I always presumed again that it was a reference to the alcohol level, but really that's not the case.
Yeah, and also people have to remember or think about the fact that Britannomyces comes from Britain, and you would think that these beers that get a little older probably had more Brett character. So this may become popular because it had less of this barnyardy, horsey flavor. So something to think about.
Yeah, people are like, hey, this actually tastes like the malt and the hops that we use to make the beer. It's not this bready, horsey thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you combine a Brett with dark malt, and you're in for a real treat. So, so the BJCP overall impression for the style is a dark, low gravity, malt focused British session ale, readily suited to drinking in quantity, refreshing yet flavorful for its strength, with a wide range of dark malt or dark sugar expression.
That's sounds like such a perfect beer to me. I mean, that is
what I want.
Yeah, it's exactly what I want to drink, and I love that it's suited to drinking in quantity. And I think that's key when you're designing any sort of British, session British ale, particularly mild, is having that very, very. You want to return to the pint, you want to refill. Yep. That is key for this style, and it's unique in that I think a lot of people, when we think about session beers that are you can just crush easily, we think about pale lager. This is a darker malt forward ale, so it has that unique quality of still being drinkable like that. We're going to break down the description as provided by the BJCP in terms of appearance. You're looking for copper to dark brown or even mahogany in color. Clarity, it should be as clear as possible, though. Mild is traditionally an unfiltered ale. The nice thing about British ale yeast, for the most part, is it's highly flocculent, and that can really help to clarify your beer quicker when you're using, compared to using less flocculent yeasts. There was also, we'll talk about this in a minute, but traditionally, British brewers often used isinglass, which is a fining agent made from fish bladder, as most people are aware. In terms of foam, you want low to moderate, off-white to tan head. It can have poor retention because of the low alcohol, though most of the mild I've made typically has decent foam retention.
Yeah, I think in general, the age and the malt character and the yeast will drive that head retention a lot.
Yeah.
So in terms of aroma, you don't want it's low to moderate hop aroma. I think something about, especially at drinkability, is you want hop flavor and then a little bit of hop bitterness, but not too much, because you don't want to go over the dark malt character that we'll talk about in a second. Low fruitiness is acceptable. I think this is going to happen generally with British yeasts.
Yeah.
But they're not too high in alcohol, so the ester generation won't be quite as prominent. Malt aroma, caramel, toffee, grainy, toasted, nutty, chocolate, lightly roasted, any combination of that. I think that all makes sense from the combination of a flavorful base malt and the dark malts you'll be using.
Yeah.
Earthy to floral hop, I think that's very standard for any English ale. And then very low diacetyl optional. I think, and especially in the low alcohol case, especially if the flavors dealing with, I think is going to be nice, a very whiff of it. But I would be very hesitant to go beyond that, especially if you know what you're doing, or if you even like diacetyl in any of your beers. So
yeah, what's so interesting? This is a little side comment here on diacetyl or diacetyl, whatever you want to call it. We have our off flavor series where we had Flavor Active send us a whole bunch of their off flavor standards, and one of them was diacetyl. I nailed DMS consistently, and most of our tasters couldn't. Diacetyl comes up, and all of the tasters almost got it right. We're able to pick that beer out, and I couldn't. And that was at a fairly high threshold. So I was like, man, how many beers have I had that have been, diacetyl bombs? But I've definitely noticed this trend, and I say this often when we're talking about off flavors, of people who are looking specifically for diacetyl. And so the reason I told my story is because when I taste caramel malt, that nice kind of rich caramely flavor, that burnt sugar thing, I think some people mistake that sometimes for diacetyl. And the reason I say that is because if my threshold, if I'm a poor taster of diacetyl and I'm getting that caramely thing, I mean, caramel has kind of a buttery characteristic to it, then other people are calling that diacetyl, and I'm in my head, I'm going, I really don't think so. I think that's an intentional, use of caramel malt or whatever that's in this beer. So I think there can be a little bit of confusion with styles like dark mild, particularly when they're as light as they are, because it makes it a little bit harder to hide things, I think. So just something to keep in mind, that the caramel malt can kind of convey that creamy thing that some people feel diacetyl, smells or tastes like.
Yeah, I think it's something where it's like a little bit of diacetyl, a little bit of malt makes 2 + 2 = 5. So you just want to watch out. It's it's a preference thing, and just don't be that guy at the meeting that yells at people for diacetyl when you get a mistake. So
yeah,
different podcast.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Flavor, much like the aroma, malt forward, bready, biscuity, toasty base, a wide range of malt flavor, especially what yeast you're using. Think about what yeast you used for this too. I know this is short and shoddy, but just think a little bit about that, because different British ale yeasts behave very differently, especially when you combine these flavors. So sweet, caramel, toffee, toasty, everything we just said about aroma, chocolate, that kind of thing. Everything's acceptable. It's dark, so you have actually a much wider range of palate to work with when you think about the flavor.
Yeah. Well, and the nice thing about on the flavor as well, when you start to get into some of those darker crystal malts, which are very common in dark mild, it's one of the ways that got that color. You can start to kind of pull out, some dark fruit, dark dried fruit characters like plum or prune, raisin, licorice even is perfectly appropriate. That's not really the angle that I prefer for mild, but I do think it's neat that you can have a lineup of different dark milds that have these different characteristics and making them unique, and yet they're still kind of clumped together in this style.
Yeah, exactly. So the dry roast finish appropriate because it has a darker malt, so you're going to get that astringency, bitterness, that kind of light roastiness.
Yeah.
Low to moderate bitterness. Again, I think you want to watch out with that dark roast malt how much you add bitterness wise. Fruity. This is interesting. Fruity esters are optional. So if you think about British ale yeast, usually to think about fruity esters that are going to come through, there are some British ale yeast that are pretty mild, like the Yorkshire Square or something like that, where if you get cold enough, you almost get no participation from the yeast. So just something to pay attention, think about that. Low hop flavor optional, so you don't really need to do a lot of late hopping, and then low diacetyl, as we talked about.
Yep, exactly. Low diacetyl in the flavor, low in the aroma. I think if you just don't have any at all, you're probably going to be better safe than sorry on that one.
Better safe than sorry on
and,
this one.
And that is a function of the British ale yeast. We know that they tend to produce they tend to be diacetyl producers, more than other ale yeast. And so just mind that. In terms of mouthfeel, you're looking for light to medium body, which kind of makes sense given how low ABV this is. Low to medium carbonation. I think a lot of people out there view this as being key to really getting the proper characteristic of a dark mild is that low carbonation, maybe served off a sparkler or a beer engine type of thing. Light astringency is appropriate in roast-based versions of dark mild. So if you're using something like chocolate malt or roasted barley, a little bit of that astringency that you get from those malts is perfectly acceptable. And sweeter versions can come across as being fuller bodied. That's something that I've personally experienced quite a few times, that when I up the crystal malt, even if I don't even know if the body is like, if the viscosity actually changes, but that sweetness does seem to create this impression of a fuller bodied, which I think works really well. The beer should not be flat, watery, or thin. That's key, is you want to have it just balanced enough with the carbonation and the body to make it palatable without it being watery, thin. That's never pleasurable in my opinion.
Yeah, you don't want this to have lack of body, just because if you think about drinking a beer, if it starts out without enough body, you're only going to lose it over time, especially in my opinion, when you lose carbonation. There's a delicate dance that carbonation and body play, especially in this beer with the low to medium low carbonation. It's a funny thing. You just have to kind of learn it for yourself and understand that. And that's why homebrewing, I think, is so important when you learn in homebrewing, is you get to control all the variables, right? You don't know when you go to the pub how they made the beer.
Yeah.
But the mouthfeel is so delicate and so preference related. It's just amazing that we can actually just drink beer and enjoy it, because I think mouthfeel is such an elusive quantity that it's hard to pin down, and yet we still enjoy it. So it's just something to think about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with dark mild, again, I just want to emphasize that your mouthfeel is going to be influenced by the way this beer is served. And again, if you don't want to go out and get a nitro tap, or if you don't want to have a beer engine at your house or whatever it might be, we're going to be talking about a little trick that I discovered a few years ago that works really well to kind of emulate that way of serving this style of beer, to give you that experience that you expect in a British pub. Vital stats, you're looking at 1030 to 1038 OG starting, 1008 to 1013 FG for an ABV range of 3 to 3.8%. Again, this is a easy drinking, low ABV. You can have multiple pints without being too sloshed type of beer. So IBU 10 to 25, so not terribly bitter, just enough to balance that malt sweetness. And then 14 to 25 SRM. That's actually a pretty wide range, which kind of conveys, again, you get this idea that it can be somewhat pale. It can have that nice coppery color, or it can go all the way into having that really deep mahogany, beautiful mahogany color. And that's going to define the way this beer tastes as well, which is really neat.
All right, so obviously for a beer, we need to have what ingredients we want to use. So how would you think about ingredients here? So malt and grains, pale British-based malt. I think Maris Otter is a great choice here. It's a very classic choice.
Yeah.
Readily available. Actually, honestly, these days it's hard to not find it used to be harder to find these kind of ingredients. You can actually get more specialty ones like Golden Promise, that kind of thing. So Maris Otter, good base malt. Crystal malts, I think really important here is to start with the English ones, especially if you can get them relatively fresh, and then find the brand you like. I think earlier to Marshall's point about some specialty malts providing you a diacetyl flavor or a flavor you don't like, then just start staying away from those brands. I think it's important not to just say, I'm going to go buy English brown malt. No, who made it? Fawcett, yeah. Simpsons, who made it? Write that down, take your notes, make your beer, and then like it. Oh, do I like it or not? I think that I took a year or 2 years of making dark amber beers, dark mild, kind of like a mild. And then until I liked the combination of malts I liked. Right. So just think about that. Think a little bit beyond the type of malt and go to the actual producer. So grain adjuncts, we want maize is appropriate. It can be to lighten it up a bit. You don't want to lighten it up too much. And then you also talk about sugars. So maybe there's an interesting ability to add sugars as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one to me. I don't think I've ever, I know for a fact I've never made a dark mild or a mild at all using sugar adjuncts, but the fact that that's noted in the BJCP leads me to believe that probably some of the manufacturers that I've consumed their beer, commercial breweries out over in England, they probably do use dark sugar adjuncts. And, it makes sense. That's kind of what you're looking for in this style anyways, or that kind of darker sugar flavor anyways, whether you get that from, dark sugars or you get that from dark crystal malts, whatever it might be. They also note, the BJCP, notes that you can use brewer's caramel for color. I'm not really a fan of that. I'd rather just have the regular color of the beer. I'm not too worried about like color correction and stuff anyways. But that's something that they note. And again, it's probably a commercial thing. Commercial brewers just trying to adjust for consistency. So, if that's what you want to do, I guess you can. Obviously, when we're talking about hops for dark mild, you're looking at classic British varieties, two in particular, Fuggles and East Kent Goldings. Both of those tend toward the more earthy and somewhat floral, side of the scale there in terms of hop character. Fuggles, in my opinion, has a really nice kind of umami character to it. It's almost mushroomy, and I love it. Some people absolutely hate it. Most people I know love East Kent Goldings, and I'm not a huge fan. To me, it tastes like orange marmalade, which I just don't like very much. So you kind of, again, that's the beauty of homebrewing. Mess around with both of these. You can pick up some Challenger. You can use some American analogs to these types of hop varieties. Something like Willamette would work really well. I've done that many times for dark mild, and it works fantastic. It tastes a little bit like a blend of Fuggles and East Kent Goldings to me. But you have those options, and that tends to be for a traditional dark mild. You're looking at EKG or Fuggles, I think.
There's a few other ones. There was Pilgrim. There's a few other ones. Sometimes I get them like a free pound when I order a bunch of hops, and it's like this extra just English. It's good. I mean, there's fun ones to use, but I think if you're just doing a batch for the first time, just picking one of these is the right way to go.
Yeah.
So British ale strains. This is where really the rubber meets the road for these recipes. I think you're pretty much locked in for your base malts, but your options for yeast are plentiful. We'll say the name of a brewer, and then there's an analog yeast, but honestly, I think every yeast producer makes a different version of it.
Yeah, so do I.
So I think it's not fair to say, oh, this is a Fuller strain. I think there's the Imperial Yeast A09 pub strain, which is Fuller's technically, 002, and then WY 1968. I think those are all very good yeasts, but they're all a little different.
Yeah, those are my the when we say something is the Fuller strain, that's kind of brushing with broad strokes. Really, what it is means these yeast labs isolated, the cells from the Fuller's beer or whatever it might be. So we have shown in the past, not necessarily with the Fuller strain, but that different yeast labs, who they're technically same strain, maybe the Chico strain or something, do tend to produce unique characteristics. So that's something to keep in mind. I love A09 Pub. It's like one of my top 5 favorite yeasts of all time. And that was purportedly sourced from Fuller's. There's the ever popular Whitbread Dry strain, which is White Labs, WLP 007 or Imperial Yeast A01 House. Safel SO4 is apparently the Whitbread Dry strain as well. If that's your jam, it does tend to be a little bit more attenuative. It will ferment a little bit lower. I love that strain too. It does really well. They say that's what Stone Brewing apparently uses.
Yes, they did.
So
yes. Something variation of that.
Yeah, yes. They're using it for American IPA. So it's a really strong yeast that does a really great job in various styles, and so that's something to keep in mind. We could go over so many different yeasts here. The key is making sure that you use a classic British strain so that you get some of that ester character, which for me tends to come across as kind of perry or maybe a little bit appley, but not your green apple acetaldehyde. Kind of that you just bit into a nice red apple kind of smell, but it's low and it blends really well with the malt and the hop. So that's key there. Let's move into the traditional brewing process for making dark mild. When I think about dark mild, or most British ale for that matter, I don't think a very complicated brewing process. I think a lot in a weird way, homebrewers took a lot from the British brewing process because of how simple it is. And what we do today, it's not again exactly what British brewers were doing, and they use some unique approaches like Yorkshire squares and stuff like that sometimes. But what we do is very similar to that basic, brewing process. So that's what we're going to go over. We'll start with water chemistry. In my opinion, I like, no matter what the style is, I tend to like a little bit more sulfate over chloride just in general because it contributes to that crisp drinkability. But I think for a lot of more malt forward styles, you're looking for a mineral profile that favors chloride to enhance that malt character. To me, it kind of imparts the beer with this rounded kind of warmth, and that works really well with dark mild. You may need to use a little bit of acidification or acid in the mash because of the use of these darker malts. So that's something to keep in mind as well if you're concerned about mash pH.
Yeah, so I think in general for mash pH, you don't want to soft hand with this, especially if you're getting weird behavior that's probably coming from a kind of water mineralization that you're not used to, or a new base malt. So just be careful balancing that, but just try to hit that 152. You don't want it to attenuate too much. There's some there can be some pre-chill effects on mouthfeel, especially for a beer this light. You just want to be careful with that.
Yeah, I agree. That and the key there again, I think you said 152 F for a mash, the mash temp. Anywhere between like 152 and probably up to like 158 or even 160, which puts you at like 67 to 71 C, 72 C. I think you could get away with. I have a little trick that I do when I'm making session beers where I mash high so I can use more grain and still fall below. The ABV is still in that range where I want it. And to me, the only reason for doing that is the more malt you use, the more flavor you're going to get. And that's just the way it works. So if you mash warmer, you might start with a higher OG, but it doesn't attenuate as much. Anyways, we're talking about traditional approaches, 152 to 156 or 67 to 69 C for about an hour to really balance that beta and alpha amylase activity. I think that's pretty typical.
So with that boil, I think this is pretty standard. 60 minutes is good. You just want to make sure you're hitting your really efficiencies. Really, boil is about efficiency. And there's obviously isomerization of alpha acids and bitterness, lower DMS. But honestly, it's really an efficiency question. Like, you are doing 60 minutes because you want to hit a target OG.
Exactly. Yeah.
So really, that's what I think. I've changed my we here on Brewlosophy really think about what we're brewing, not just run the standard stuff always all the time, talk about bitterness in a certain way. Boiling is really about condensing your wort. It's not so much about the DMS, in my opinion, as much as it was anymore. So
yeah, these days at least, I agree with you.
These ways, so chilling, just want to make sure it's cold, good cold break in your leave that back, or at least part of it back in the boil kettle, and then rack a little. You want some trub. There is definitely enough data out there to suggest trub is important for fermentation. You don't want it to be super clean. So chilling it, getting a hot break, cold break out, and moving on. Fermentation, pretty standard. The 68 Fahrenheit's a good one. I mean, honestly, I'd probably go maybe a little lower just to control the ester development, especially in this style where you don't want a ton of ester development. But then again, but you have light OG, you're not going to get a ton of esters.
Yeah.
The fermentation's going to be very fast. I just want to make sure it's complete. You don't want to leave any diacetyl, any of that kind of stuff around. So,
yeah.
Finding and filtration, traditionally unfiltered. This goes into this would go into a with maybe going to finding agents at the kegging level or at the pin level when you're doing a clean draw or a hand pull from a hand pump. You notice your yeast, if you use 002 for instance, that thing's going to drop like egg drop soup, right? You're not going to leave a lot of anything back in the beer itself, so shouldn't need too much finding. Isinglass, fish bladders would be the common one in especially traditional English brewing. But little biofine will go a long way too, so don't freak out.
Yeah. The biofine. I mean, I've used gelatin fining in British ale, like dark mild. I've also just let them not find them at all, and they tend to clear up pretty quickly because of how flocculent that yeast is. But isinglass is a traditional fining agent. Like I said, that comes from fish bladders, so it sounds really weird. I watched a video years ago of somebody using isinglass in a firkin, and yeah, it cleared this beer up really quickly. So it's effective. But anyways, you could just let your beer sit as well. I think that's a pretty common approach. When it comes to packaging, carbonation, and serving, you're looking for pretty low carbonation, about 1.7 volumes of CO2 traditionally, though I've read recommendations that it can get up to about 2.2 volumes if you're serving it off of a keg and then you just kind of pour it hard into the glass. Now, there is, again, these beers are typically served at what they call cellar temperature, which is about 52 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's about 11 degrees C, something like that. And which is warm. I mean, that's warmer than most Americans are used to drinking their beers, but it allows those flavors to really, be expressed. And if you've never had a beer, a dark mild or any British ale for that matter, served at cellar temps off of a beer engine, you really are missing out. There was a reason I think that beer got popular in Britain is because of how delicious that can be.
Mm-hmm. Nitro is another way of representing that, but I think it's nowhere near a traditional cask ale. If you can find a place around you that does it traditionally and does it consistently, I mean, you're not going to find a ton of places. There's only like one in all of Los Angeles that is doing it correctly, in my opinion. But if once in a while they do it and they don't leave it sitting around for weeks at a time, it's going to be good. So
yeah. Well, and one the little trick that I mentioned earlier, I'll share it here. It's kind of difficult to explain, but if you have children, you likely have these little medicine plungers just hanging out in your house. They're everywhere. We have so many of these, and they use them for giving babies medicine. So they're usually about 10 mils max. This idea was presented somewhere online. I couldn't tell you where, and I couldn't find it when I was trying to look it up. But the approach is to emulate what happens when you serve a beer either on nitro or sort of off of a cask with a sparkler and an engine. Basically, what you do is you fill up your glass with beer. Maybe you're going to want to go about 70% full in your glass. You pull about 5 milliliters of beer into one of these syringe things. Then you pull it out of the beer and you pull the rest all the way up so there's some air in there. And then you re-put it into the beer and very quickly squirt everything out with the air, and it creates this incredibly fine foam that I'm telling you surprisingly feels like it was poured, off of a sparkler. The foam. I've done this so many times. It's actually whenever I make session British ale these days, I actually do it most of the time that I'm drinking. You want to carbonate a little bit higher because you're gonna knock a lot of that CO2 out, but it creates this just beautiful fine line of foam that just kind of sits atop the beer and it takes some of that carbonation out, so it feels a little bit more classic. Really neat trick. That's cheap. You can get these syringes for free if you go to your pharmacy. They usually just give them out for free. So something to try for those of you who are looking who don't want to get a nitro or Firkin setup. You can just do this little trick.
That's a very cool trick.
Yeah.
So what's a good example in the style? Clean malt character, low bitterness hop and low hop character, British fermentation character, light apple pear. So it's a very simple beer. I think drinkability is going to be paramount here, and drinkability is going to go to personal preference too. So if you don't like what it turned out, I mean, you look at the variables, right? If you didn't like the ester profile, change your ester, change your yeast, change your fermentation temperature. If you didn't like the malt profile, change the brand of malt. Change one thing at a time, see where you end up.
Yeah.
I guarantee you're going to find the ingredients you want out of this beer. It's going to happen.
If you like beer, you can make a dark mild that you love. I am convinced of that.
Exactly.
This is one of those styles that there's just enough range in how it can be displayed, all of those characteristics that you can find a version that works for you, and some that don't. I'm not a huge fan of the hyper roasty versions. I'll drink them, but that's not what I'm looking for. I tend to prefer the more nutty, bready, biscuity with a slight sweetness in there, and Fuggles hops. I don't want that EKG character in mine. So there are some notable commercial examples the BJCP lists. Now, I've never tried any of these that I'm aware of. Brains Dark, Green King Double X Mild, and Hobson's Champion Mild. I don't think I've ever had any of those, but maybe you have, Andy.
They were all they were probably imported once years ago, and they're still sitting on the shelf somewhere. I mean, those are all beers that exist. If you go over there, you're going to find these beers. Especially they're going to be probably only on cask, but they're available. I think in the United States, you're only going to find like a Fuller's or some example like that, or a local brewery. Now the question is, does the local brewery care enough to make a really good example, or they just call it dark mild to say dark mild? A lot of people will just brew a Hefeweizen and call it whatever, or really what you'll find is people brew a Berliner Weiss where they added lactic acid to the beer, right? You don't want those guys.
Yeah.
To do dark mild, if you're going to say, it's kind of like today, I think Czech dark lagers coming into vogue in a lot of places, especially lager brewing and dark lagers is coming around. So people are doing a good job. If someone's saying they have a dark mild, it's probably going to be good, but just check it out.
Yeah. Oh man, I'll tell you, one of the best dark milds I've had recently was Crow and Wolf. Brad made a dark mild using all classic approach ingredients. Maris Otter with this beer is phenomenal. Easy to drink, has all of those qualities. Now, I honestly can't recall what commercial beers I had when I was in London, but I know that I loved drinking the mild while I was there. I don't remember them being called dark mild, but they were in a range of colors. I loved it so much that I came home. I've brewed numerous batches of this style on my own. I'm still a huge fan of this, and I was curious how one would turn out if I cut a bunch of corners in the brewing process. So that's exactly what I did. Results from that short and shoddy brew when we're back from this break. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. There are a handful of beer styles that I tend to think of as being more complicated to brew, but British Ale is certainly not one of them, like I mentioned before. In fact, my experience has always been that they're some of the easiest styles to make. And, you know, so when I went into this short and shoddy dark mild brew day, I was like, how much easier can it get? Well, let's just cut a whole bunch of time out and see if it still turns out well. For this batch, I brewed using my 240 volt SS Brewtech electric system. This is a full volume brew in a bag setup. My start time was 10:17 a.m. in the morning, and I started by collecting the full volume of water that I run through. I do not want chlorine in my beer, but I run the water through just a very cheap, like $30 RV filter. That's a carbon filter, and then I added an unmeasured amount of gypsum and calcium chloride. Though I know what my water is like. I'm used to seeing about how much minerals I'm adding when I'm weighing them out. So I had a good idea that the amounts I was adding did favor sulfate a little bit more. Again, that's my preference, and this is short and shoddy, so that's the reason I did that. I wanted a little bit more of that crisp characteristic as opposed to what I refer to as that kind of warm, kind of like rounded malt character. So that's what I went with. Grain bill was 67% Mecca grade La Manta pale malt, 13% Mecca grade Venora Vienna malt, and 10% Golden Naked Oats, 7% medium crystal malt, and 3% roasted barley. That is a very kind of a classic grist that I've used before, except for the Golden Naked Oats. This was my first time, I believe, ever using Golden Naked Oats. It was something that I heard about years ago from Michael Tonsmeyer and was always curious to try out. I believe he uses it in his hazy IPA, but I wanted to try it out in this. It sounded like it. And what Golden Naked Oats are is just crystal malt made out of oats, out of oat malt. So it's like a 10 love or like a 15 love crystal malt out of oats instead of barley. Pretty cool stuff. What do you think of that grain bill?
Yeah, this is solid. I mean, I think you get the having 2/3 of this be specialty malts, I think is important. Yeah, 2/3 to a quarter of it. 1/3 to 1/4 of it being specialty malt to get that flavor, because you're going to get a ton of flavor from that pale malt, but especially the darker, the caramel, the coffee, the roastiness is coming from everything else. That's good. So it's a good balance, I think.
Yeah, and if you listened closely, you heard that I was using a blend of Mecca grade pale malt and their Venora or Vienna malt. What I would usually do there is just use Maris Otter. Simpson's Maris Otter is one of my favorite grains of all time. And so my idea with this blend was, well, I don't have Maris Otter on hand. This is short and shoddy. I'm going out. I've got this La Manta. I've got this has Venora? What if I blend those in a way that kind of gives me, based on my experience with both of those malts, some of that breadiness, maybe amplifies the breadiness over just that clean, barley malt flavor that I get from La Manta Pale Malt. So that was the reasoning for doing that. I was, again, trying to kind of create my own version of what I perceive in Maris Otter. You're not gonna emulate Maris Otter. To me, I get a beautiful, almost peanutty kind of characteristic from a good quality Maris Otter. You're not going to get that from blending pale malt and Vienna malt, but it can get kind of close. So when the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and stirred to incorporate. I stirred to incorporate that before checking to ensure it was at my target mash temperature of 154 Fahrenheit or 68 C. I left the mash for just 30 minutes. Boy, that's blasphemous. After which the grains were removed and the wort was boiled for just 25 minutes. I added 30 grams of Fuggles at that 25-minute mark, 15 grams of Fuggles at 15 minutes, 15 grams of Fuggles at 5 minutes as well. Now, something to note, and I think this is something that was a part of the short and shoddy thing that I wondered about a little bit, is that these Fuggles, again, this was brewed in 2021. So these Fuggles were from crop year 2018. So they were 3 years old, and I'm telling you right now, they were not stored in a vacuum sealed bag. I just left them in the Mylar bag that I got from Yakima Valley Hops. So that was another risk we were going to take on this one.
I mean, I don't honestly think there's going to be any trouble there. You're not trying to do a hyper-specific hazy IPA with the freshest hops and the most freshest needed Nectaron and numbered labeled stuff. Fuggles, it's going to be fine for a few years in a freezer, no problem.
Yeah, and I think that cold storage is really the key. Obviously, oxygen will cause deterioration fairly rapidly, but when you keep it cold, it kind of retards that deterioration quite a bit. So that's what I've been doing lately anyways. Now, I will say the one short and shoddy batch that did not turn out for me is one where I used older hops, and I think that was the reason it didn't turn out really well. So going into this one, who knows, right? When the boil was complete, again, 25-minute boil. When that was done, we chilled the wort to 74 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 degrees Celsius with my jaded Hydra immersion chiller. That was as cold as I could get it given my groundwater temperature, so that's where it stayed. I took a refractometer reading that showed the wort was at 1032 OG for a brew house efficiency of 67%. In my experience with short and shoddy brewing, when I reduce the mash length down to half an hour from an hour, I do see a little bit of a hit in my overall conversion efficiency. This one was pretty good. 67% is perfectly fine for me. And that's something that I see when I'm making lower OG beers in general. My efficiency tends to go up a little bit. So it kind of balanced the fact that I mashed for a little bit less time. However, I think I would have done a lot better if I hadn't have used the extra 1 gallon or 4 liters of water that I accidentally added to this one. I only realized after the fact as I was looking at the recipe again and everything going, wait a minute, I know I used, 8 gallons instead of the 7 gallons that this recipe calls for. So the fact that I still got 1032 OG, which is 2 points higher than the lowest recommended by the BJCP, I was pretty pleased with that.
I mean, yeah, that's a pretty good number, and you're hitting the numbers you want on the style guidelines. I think that's fine. You could have been a little higher, too. I don't think it would have mattered too much. I think you're going to find it's still going to be dark mild, especially just because you're not really creeping up on your alcohol too much. So
yeah, exactly. I then pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast A09 Pub into this 74 degree or 23C wort. That's warm. Pitching too warm, you're going to get terrible off flavors. That's what we do with these short and shoddy things. At this point, the fermenter was connected to my glycol chiller, which was set to maintain a fermentation temperature of 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19C. The time was 12:13 p.m. for a total brew day time of 1 hour and 6 minutes. Holy moly.
Oh, this is a fast brew day, man. I don't know. This beer's probably going to suck. It was too quick.
I remember being done like, man, I feel like I just got out here. Oh, I did just get out here. And I've only been out here for an hour. So again, like I said, the fermenter was connected to my glycol, 66 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees C. And after just 4 days of fermentation, which was very active, kicked off right away. After 4 days, there was no signs of fermentation. So I took a hydrometer measurement showing that the beer finished at a rather good, I think, 1009 FG for an ABV of 3.0. I mean, you could drink a ton of this stuff and you'd be
good.
fine. Yeah, pretty good in my opinion. I cold crashed the beer to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius under pressure overnight, about 15 hours. And then I pressure transferred the beer to a CO2 purged keg. Again, this is short and shoddy. It's not intended to try to ruin the beer. I'm going to take measures that we know do tend to have a negative impact on beer and not do those. Otherwise we're just making bad beer on purpose. And that's not the point of short and shoddy. So I did rack these into CO2 purged kegs. I did not find this beer. That was one of the things I remember contemplating going, oh, do I want to add gelatin? Well, A09 Pub is so flocculent and falls out so well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to skip that whole piece of it for this short and shoddy. The beer was then burst carbonated at 50 PSI for 13 hours before I reduced the gas to 14 PSI. That's my serving pressure with how long my lines are. And then after just 3 days of conditioning, it was ready for evaluation. When you look at the picture of this beer, Andy, obviously there's condensation on the outside of the glass. It's so hard sometimes, depending on the weather where we live, to snap a picture of these beers in the glass without that condensation. But to me, the color, the clarity is good through the condensation. It just looks like a nice dark mild in my opinion, but I could be patting my own back here.
No, this is great. This is picture perfect. Realistically, I mean, it's the right color, and like you said, the haze is immaterial to this beer. It would have, if you do another week in the keg, it'll be totally bright.
Yeah,
right. So you're picture perfect. Looks great.
Yeah, beautiful, like this dark copper color. I would say it was bordering on mahogany, but man, was it pretty! And just the lightest of tan heads, almost white. In my opinion, it was pretty sticky. It stuck around for a while. Again, that's something that I tend to experience. That could be a function of the Mecca grade malt, which I know is got a decent protein content in it. Regardless, I thought it was a very good looking beer. Now, my personal impressions on it, even with its low alcohol level, this beer felt like it was lacking nothing, which made it very, very pleasurable to drink. I really, really enjoyed this one. While any hop character was perceptibly absent, the bitterness was just enough to balance this toast and kind of caramel sweet flavor from the malt. I mean, I really loved this beer. I was so happy with the way it came out, and the fact that it only took me, a bump over an hour to make was pretty impressive to me. But my opinion isn't all that matters, obviously. So we served this beer to 15 tasters, 15 blind tasters. Well, they were informed of the style that they were drinking and actually provided with the BJCP overall impression or the style description. They were not told anything about the way it was brewed. So the way we do these short and shoddy surveys is we serve them to people and just kind of act like, oh, we made this beer. We're using this data to tell us how well we did brewing it, whatever. And a lot of the tasters don't even know, what a short and shoddy brew day is, so whatever. I'll usually tell them after the fact if they ask for an explanation as to what I'm really doing. In terms of how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer was, tasters seem to perceive the strongest characteristic as being, predictably, its maltiness, which yielded an average rating of about 3.6 out of 5. Tasters rated the dryness at about 2.8 out of 5, while hoppiness was the lowest rated at 1.9 out of 5. That all lines up with exactly what I would expect for dark mild. What do you say, Andy?
No, this is good. You have the I like this maltiness is right above that middle range where it's not like too cloying, right? If you're really getting a lot of maltiness, and maybe it's off for this beer.
Yeah.
And then dry, this is all good. This all lines up. This is good.
Not it too all dry. Lines up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. And that was something that people were commenting on actually, as they were, we'd finish the evaluation and we all pour ourselves full pints and drink this. And I remember people saying, they were like, it's got a really nice blend of like toasty with sweet, and that was kind of what I was aiming for. So I was glad that came through. Breaking down these characteristics in terms of hops, the most prominent hop characteristic people noted, 7 out of 15 said it was earthy, 3 each rated spicy and floral as being the most prominent, and 1 each said melon and berry. Nobody endorsed fruity, pine resinous, dank caddy, or onion garlic. I'm glad that nobody perceived those in this beer, and I would say I probably would go on the I would probably have gone earthy because I did use Fuggles, and that's what I tend to get, like a mushroomy, earthy thing. Though I kind of, I remember this beer having a kind of a slight floral thing going on as well. That may have been, my perception of the blend of earthy hops with that kind of estery yeast character. But to me, again, I think that lines up pretty well with what we'd expect for a dark mild in terms of malt character. 7 out of 15 of the tasters put caramel sweet. 2 each noted toasty and nutty, and then 1 each put cracker, bread crust, and roast. Nobody endorsed chocolate. I mean, again, it's kind of this blend of that sweet, toasty, crackery, roasty thing. That is what a dark mild is. So the fact that it was kind of spread out like that makes sense to me.
It makes sense. Everyone's percepting a little bit different of each part of the beer a little differently. So I think this range is accurate.
Yeah. So far things are looking pretty good, I'd say. In terms of yeast character, predictably, 7 out of 15 said esters. 6 thought it was a clean fermentation character, and 2 people noted phenolics. Now, with the description that we have for phenolics, is one of the words is smoky, and I think some people perceive roast character as kind of smoky, and so it makes again, not everybody is an expert on beer descriptions and understanding what phenolics are and stuff like that. So that again, I didn't taste any phenolics in this beer. There was no chlorophenols. There was nothing smoky in my opinion. There was nothing like that. There was no clove. But some people noted it. Again, 7 out of 15 though, almost half felt that esters was the driving yeast character, and that makes sense to me. That's what I would have put as well. But I also knew that this was a dark mild fermented with AO9 pub. So
Sure.
Not a single person noted an off flavor. That makes me feel really good when we serve these beers that are brewed in such weird ways to people, and they don't notice any off flavors. That to me is pretty cool.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, that's excellent. Actually, no diacetyl, no nothing, no DMS, no acetaldehyde. That's great.
Yeah, and again, you would kind of expect. Let's break this down. A 30-minute mash. Okay, maybe you're gonna get lower malt character, whatever. People used to say that reducing the mash length could lead to a thinner beer, can lead to like less malt character. Nobody noted that. We did a 25-minute boil, so oh boy, there should be a bunch of DMS in there. Nobody noticed any DMS. Pitched really warm, so you might expect there to be some higher alcohols or fusel alcohols, and nobody noticed that. There was no diacetyl noted. This was just a normal dark mild that people, well, we'll get to this in a sec, but people seemed to enjoy. Now, one of the questions we ask that I find really interesting, and it's one that is very subjective because it's based hugely on people's past experience with these styles of beers. We ask them, how closely does this version you're drinking, one, represent the styles that you've had before, or like examples of dark mild that you've had before, but also base it off of what we shared with you from the BJCP, the overall impression that they share. 2 out of the 15 people rated it a 5 out of 5, meaning they thought it was a perfect example of the style. That's awesome. 9 other people, so already we're at 11, rated it a 4 out of 5. So really, really close to a classic example. And then 4 rated it a 3 out of 5. Nobody rated it a 2, 1, or 0 out of 5. So
that's really awesome.
What does that say to you, right? That to me, it seems to indicate that this is a pretty good representation of a dark mild.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you're getting no one saying it's off, right? That's saying if it's nothing's 2 to 5, it's not out of style, right? That's getting a 30 or below on the BJCP score sheet, right? So no one's saying it's totally missing the mark. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, my opinion, brewers say this all the time. I'm going to brew what I like to drink. That's what I'm going to do what I want to drink, whatever. It still feels good to know that other people enjoy what you're making though, you know? And the fact that this representation question, that so many people felt it was a good example. Again, that I'm like, all right, we're on to something here. We then asked tasters to rate their preference. So regardless of what you think of how representative of the style it is, how did you like drinking it? 4 out of the 15 people rated it a 5 out of 5. That means that they really, really, really like it. And, I tend to be, there's this thing called the halo effect and all of that. I tend to be one of those people who always goes with like a 4 out of 5. I'm kind of cautious unless somebody asks me to rate something like a 5 out of 5, like we do with this show on Apple Podcasts, if you haven't done that yet. And I will tend to, there's always something you can find, right? So 4 out of 15 people, 5 out of 5. And then another 9 people rated it a 4 out of 5. And the rest of the people, the other 2 rated it a 3 out of 5. Again, nobody rated it a 2, a 1, or a 0 on their preference, which means they liked drinking this beer. They thought it tasted good. That's awesome to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, this is great. This is excellent. I mean, that means just they just straight up enjoy the beer. Yeah, I think maybe if you skew the bell curve down, the like you said, halo effect, I think it could have been more 4 out of 5. But still, no one's doing it. No one's dinging your beer too much too. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, or they're just really nice to me. I mean, the thing is that these are anonymous surveys. We ask people to put their quote name, but really most people just put like an initial or something. And the reason we do that is so we can track double submissions and make sure that we're not counting somebody twice or anything like that. Mm-hmm. But it's not like they're trying to make me feel good. I've served these beers, these short and shoddy beers to people, and they just don't like the style. So I have to believe that this was a decent representation of the style based on what others think, and pretty good version because people seem to like it. Personally, I loved this beer. I've said that before. I would make this exact version of this beer, short and shoddy with the same exact ingredients again, because it was so good. Now, if you can't get your hands on Mecca Great Estate Malt, obviously pick up some Maris Otter, grab some Golden Promise, make your own little blend of pale malt and Vienna malt, or maybe toss in a little bit of Munich malt. I could see that working out really well too. Now, given the absence of noted off flavors in this dark mild, I'd have to say the short and shoddy approach didn't seem to have much of a negative impact. And that's awesome.
That's cool. No, I mean, you nailed the style. And like we've said about these short and shoddy methods, it's, we're trying to focus on optimizing time, but we're not trying to de-optimize for flavor or anything like that. So I think just goes to show you the quality of the recipe and ingredients is really paramount versus the time. Yeah.
Well, and minding the areas that we know do tend to have a negative impact. Like I said, you don't want to oxidize this beer, so don't oxidize it. That's short and shoddy. To reiterate, a lot of people think that, well, if it was really short and shoddy, you'd ferment in a fermenter that was never cleaned and sanitized. But no, we're not trying to ruin the beer. We're trying to see how good of a beer we can make while cutting a bunch of corners. That's the key. So, and in this case, I think it worked out really well. Now, we've got a couple of reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from L. Burns, who says, it might be interesting to see what people think if you dial the CO2 down to 1.8 to 2.0 volumes and the serving temp up to 12C, which is 54 degrees Fahrenheit. What do you think about that, Andy?
I mean, you could. It's a question. I mean, I think serving it more colder and letting it warm up is better. It's just my opinion. So
that is exactly my opinion as well, Andy. Is I would rather if I want the drinker of the stuff that I brew to have more control over what they're drinking. So if you want it warmer, let it sit wrap your hands around your glass, let it sit on the bar for a little bit longer, whatever. You can't cool a beer down yourself, right? So I would rather, because I like my mild cold. I like it warm, but I still want to serve it cold, The other thing, I talked about that little syringe trick. You can do that to bust out some of that the CO2 so it's not as sparkly. When I'm drinking at home, dark mild, when I make one, I have that syringe literally sitting in a little glass of sanitizer right next to my kegerator. and if I'm serving one to somebody, I'll do that. I want them to have that experience. I don't want to have to go out and get a whole beer engine set up. So that is the alternative that I use that I think works really great. So so just to respond to your comment, L. Burns, I totally get what you're saying. I actually think it would be really, really interesting to see if there is a difference in the way people perceive or enjoy a dark mild that's served cold and a little bit more carbonated versus one that's served more traditionally. I do think that would be interesting as well. Next comment comes from Nigel Brewer. He left this on Facebook. He says, mild has got to be one of my favorite beers, perfect for all seasons, full of flavor, but not in booze. Even though most people consider them boring, when they're fresh, they are absolutely crushable and won't leave your head mangled after a few pints.
I mean, this is true. I think this is the point of the styles of beer that are under, I think that's why Pils, light lager is so popular that you can have a few of these, right? You can spend time, and I think as like Augie Carton from Carton Brewing has said, like, you don't have to think about the beer, right? It's something you don't have to, you can let it be with you. You let your experience, what you're doing with the beer, do it rather. I think in the last 10 years, craft beer has obviously exploded, or maybe even 20 years, but maybe last 10, where the beer becomes the focus. That's why we go to some of these beer festivals and stuff like that. But realistically, beer is meant just to be had with something else, food or company. So these are the kind of styles where you can just enjoy everything else, and the beer becomes just a social lubricant, which is what it always was.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know if I would ever describe mild as being boring, though. I almost, it's weird because I get where Nigel's coming from, because I would say it's a basic beer. It really is like a beer flavored beer that's not Pilsner, and that is part of what I think I love so much about British ale in general. But to me, mild should come across as curiously complex, as having these different characteristics. You read the BJCP description, it's got this myriad version or myriad malt characteristics that it can have in there. You can use different hops to kind of amplify different characteristics there. All these different yeast strains, some that you may love, some that you may hate. I'm not a big fan of the Yorkshire Square yeast, that's just a personal preference thing, but I love AO9 Pub. That's the fuller strain. So there's so much tweaking you can do with this style. And the fact that we could brew one in an hour and 6 minutes. If you had a 120 volt system or a propane system, you're probably, let's just call it an hour and a half with cleanup. I think that's awesome. And you could have such a beautifully, beautiful looking, beautiful tasting beer on tap, a week and a half after making it and only spending a couple of hours doing it. I think that's just so rad.
Yeah, this is nice. I mean, it's cool to see it done so quickly and that people liked it so much. And really, this is a good blueprint. If you've never done a short and shoddy before, well, here you go. Here's exactly what you do. And everyone's loving it.
Yeah.
Especially from 15 different people. And, more than half are saying this is a fantastic example. Come on, this is... What better example you want of short and shoddy? Yeah,
if you've been afraid to try this crazy short and shoddy approach, I think giving it a go with a British ale, I think you're going to be really, really safe. Maybe don't jump into doing the crazy lager stuff that we do, pale lagers fermented at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever. Try it with a British ale, and I think you'll be pleased with the outcome. Well, Andy, I think that about covers dark mild. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap things up?
I think like anything, any style guidelines, you're working with new beers, definitely just try your ingredients. And I think this is a great example of short and shoddy is spending the time, minimizing your time, focusing on ingredients and ingredient choices. And if you don't like this batch, well, it's only 5 gallons of beer. You can give it away. You can dump it, try it again. I mean, the ingredients do get a little expensive, hard to acquire, but don't fret not enjoying it. Try it out. If you don't like it, tweak it next time, and you can iterate a lot faster with short and shoddy, in my opinion. So
yeah, well, and I'll tell you, I don't often recommend the recipes that I come up with, but if you're looking for a good version of dark mild, I cannot recommend this recipe. And you don't need to have Mecca grade La Manta and Venora. You can just replace those two with Maris Otter, or even just like Great Western Pale Malt. I mean, you're going to be fine with whatever you can get for your base malt. It's really the everything else. It's kind of the gestalt of this whole recipe that just worked out so well. So I was happy with it. Others were happy with it. And I think you guys might be happy with it as well. Well, remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy dark mild brew day. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.